Hello, my name is David Stephen Cohen. This is a remake of a talk I posted on YouTube in 2021 titled The Limits of Advocacy, The Case of the Lumbee Indians. I first learned about the Lumbee Indians when I was taking a graduate seminar in regional and occupational folklore at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was working towards my PhD in American civilization. Another graduate student presented a paper on what was then called a triracial group in North Carolina, said to be the descendants of the Lost Colony of Roanoke, who intermarried with indigenous Croatoan Indians. I knew of a similar group living on the border between New Jersey and New York State, then known as the Jackson Whites. I wrote my doctoral dissertation about them based on my fieldwork and historical studies. I learned that contrary to oral tradition, which claimed that they were the descendants of Hessian mercenaries during the American Revolution, Tuscarora Indians migrating from North Carolina to join the Iroquois Confederacy in New York, escaped slaves, and prostitutes procured by a man named Jackson, I found instead that they were they descended from free black landowners who were culturally Dutch. My dissertation was published in 1974 as a book titled The Ramapo Mountain People. A few years after the publication of the book, the Ramapo Mountain People applied to the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, the BIA, for recognition as an Indian tribe. After an extensive review of the evidence by a genealogist, a historian, and an anthropologist, the BIA denied their petition, supporting my conclusion that there was no primary source evidence that they descended as a group from a historic tribe. Again, after working for 9 years as an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in Newark, and 28 years as a research associate at the New Jersey Historical Commission, a state agency in Trenton, New Jersey, I retired to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I discovered that the Lumbees had applied for full recognition by an act of Congress. According to their official website, the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina consists of 55,000 members living primarily in Robeson, Hoke, Cumberland, and Scotland counties in North Carolina. They claim to be the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River. During their history, they have been known by several names: the Croatans, the Cherokee, the Tuscarora, and now the Lumbees. Their name comes from the Lumber River, formerly known as Drowning Creek, which runs through North Carolina into South Carolina as a tributary of the Little Pee River, which flows into the Great Pee River. Yet the Lumbees have no reservation, no treaties with the federal government, and no survivals of Indian language, customs, or beliefs. The Lumbees are in a rather unique situation. They were recognized by the federal government by an act of Congress in 1956, but that act denied them any of the benefits that came from being a federally recognized tribe. The Office of Indian Affairs opposed the Lumbee Act of 1956 on the ground that the Lumbees had no treaty with the United States and the act might impose additional financial burdens on the federal government. In response to the Office of Indian Affairs, the Senate Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs amended the bill to read that that nothing in the act would qualify the Lumbees for any services provided by the United States for Indian tribes. This should be seen in the context of the fact that in 1953 the federal government had passed the Indian Termination Act, which aimed at ending the government's policy of considering Native Americans as wards of the government. Under this act, a number of Native American tribes, such as the Delaware Indians in Oklahoma, were detribalized. The federal government later realized that the termination policy had been in effect, and the law was repealed in 1958. But this left the Lumbees in a position of being prevented from applying for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for recognition. Since then, the Lumbees have attempted to gain benefits denied them in 1956, but their efforts have been unsuccessful. There are two ways that a tribe can be recognized by the federal government. The first is by an act of Congress. A number of tribes have achieved recognition by this path, including the Mashantucket Pequod tribe in Connecticut, who were granted recognition in 1983. The tribe then opened a high-stakes bingo hall in 1986, which expanded into the Foxwood Casino after the passage of the Federal Indian Game Act of 1988. The second method is by what is now called the Office of Federal Acknowledgement within the U.S. Department of Interior. This used to be called the Bureau of Acknowledgement and Research, the BAR, within the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Department of Interior. In 2006, the Lumbees had introduced a bill to Congress for full recognition, but it was again posed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and this time by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians, a federally recognized tribe in western North Carolina. Another bill nearly passed Congress in 2010, would have recognized the Lumbee Indians of North Carolina with full benefits and immunities, except the right to conduct gaming activities. Several historians and anthropologists testified in favor of the bill, but the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, which runs a hotel casino in Cherokee, North Carolina, opposed it. The bill was passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate Committee of Indian Affairs, and it was reported out to the full Senate for passage. Anthropologist Jack Campisi testified as an expert witness in favor of the 2006 bill. He holds a doctorate in anthropology and was the author and expert witness in a number of tribal recognition cases, including those of the Mashpee Indians of Cape Cod and the Mashantucket Pequod in Connecticut. Between 1982 and 1988, Campisi conducted research on the Lumbees, and he wrote the historical narrative in a petition that was submitted in 1987 to the Branch of Acknowledgement and Research of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Lumbee petition was submitted as supporting evidence in the accompanying House of Representatives version of the bill. In his written testimony before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs in 2006, Dr. Campisi stated, quote, "At the time of sustained white contact, there existed a Cheraw Indian community precisely where the Lumbees reside today. A 1725 map made by John Herbert showed the Cherokee tribe between the Pee River and Drowning Creek. In 1737, John Thompson purchased land in the same general area from the Cheraw, and in 1754, Governor Arthur Dobbs of North Carolina identified on Drowning Creek, on the head of the PD, 50 families, a mixed crew or breed of lawless people filled the lands without patent or paying quit rents, shot a surveyor for coming to view vacant lands being enclosed by a great swamp." Unquote. A document written in 1771 refers to the Cheraw settlement on Drowning Creek, and another dated on 1773 contains a list that were connected to the community, connected this community to the Cheraw in 1773. Some of the same names as the Lumbees appear on that list. The 1725 map by John Herbert, the Commissioner of Indian Trade for the Wino factory on the Black River, however, shows the Cheraw, S-A-R-A-W, Cheraw settlement along the Pee River, not near Drowning Creek, which is mentioned above as a tributary of the Little Pee River further to the northeast. In addition, Campisi asserted, quote, "The oldest Lumbee community that can be continuously documented was called Long Swamp, now called Prospect, and located within the core of the Pembroke and Smith Townships, the heart of the modern-day Lumbee community. It is also located right in the heart of the so-called Old Field of the Cheraw, documented in land records between 1737 and 1739, unquote. However, this doesn't match the documents Campisi cited in the Lumbee petition. In one of them, the one dated March 1739, the Welsh residents living at southwest Drowning Creek complained to the South Carolina Council about the Cheraw Indians coming onto their land to hunt. The petition was not sent to the North Carolina Council, an indication of the fact that the Indians were coming from South Carolina. In the other document, John Thompson of PD presented two land deeds dated August 1737, in which he bought land from the Cheraw on the northeast and southwest side of the PD River, except for two, quote, old fields reserved by the Cheraw, one of which was held by Thomas Grooms. Thus, the two old fields reserved for the Cheraw were in South Carolina, not along Drowning Creek in North Carolina. And the 1773 list of names to which Campisi referred identifies the 21 individuals being as 3 Locklears, 5 Grooms, and 1 Cheraw, all Lumbee surnames. A full quotation from the 1754 report by Arthur Dobbs, mentioned by Campisi, is as follows. Colonel Rutherford's regiment of foot in Bladen County, 441, a troop of horse, a new company necessary to be made at Waccammaw, James Kerr recommended for captain, Drowning Creek on the head of the Little PD, 50 families, a mixed crew of lawless people, filled the lands without patent or paying quit rents, shot a surveyor for coming to view vacant lands being enclosed by great swamps. Quakers attend or pay as the northern counties finds not high enough to oblige the militia to attend musters. No armed stores or Indian in the county, unquote. Campisi drew the following conclusion from the above statement. It is, quote, it is clear that there was a community of 300 or more individuals on Drowning Creek that held land in common. The most reasonable explanation for its existence, given the lack of white settlement in the area, is that the community consisted of recent tribal members. However, this conclusion is not warranted by the evidence. The reference is to a mixed crew of lawless people squatting on the land, not to Cheraw Indians holding the land in common. If anything, the full quotation states that there are, quote, no armed stores or Indian in the county, unquote. Campisi dismissed this latter statement as by citing a proclamation dated 1753 by Matt Rowan, governor of North Carolina, that, quote, sundry people, under the pretense of the authority of South Carolina, have come into Anson County to survey lands which he referred to as a frontier to the Indians. The proclamation commanded the militia to apprehend these offenders. Campisi concluded, quote, at the time, Drowning Creek formed the boundary between Bladen and Anson counties. Apparently, the Indian community was on the Anson side of the river. There is a reference to Anson County being on the frontier to the Indians. The inescapable conclusion is that the community on Drowning Creek was an Indian community, unquote. This conclusion is neither inescapable nor does it follow from the historical evidence. The ancestors of the Lumbees held lands in Bladen County in a region which in 1787 became Robeson County, not in Anson County. In addition, the 1775 map by Henry Mousson, based on a 1771 map by James Cook, clearly shows the Cheraw precinct on the west side of the Great PD River in South Carolina, not along Drowning Creek, which is a tributary of the Little Pedee in Bladen County, North Carolina. Meanwhile, in March 2010, the Lumbee Tribal Council signed a contract with Lewin International, a company based in Nevada that consults on casino operations. The contract provided that Lewin would lobby for the recognition bill if the Lumbees eventually were permitted to open a casino, and then Lewin would have the right to develop the property. When the deal was made public, the Lumbees quickly canceled the contract, but it was too late. A group of 5 unnamed senators put a stop to the bill in a procedure by which any senator anonymously can threaten a filibuster to block a bill from passage. A similar bill was introduced to the House of Representatives in January 2011 and a companion bill to the Senate in the same year, and again in 2020, which almost passed the Senate and President Donald Trump promised to sign. The episode raises the issue of what are the limits to advocacy when historical evidence is pitted against oral tradition. Soon after the Lumbee recognition bill was forwarded for final vote in the United States Senate, a new book was published in the spring of 2010 by the University of North Carolina Press, titled Lumbee Indians in the Jim Crow South, Race, Identity, and the Making of a Nation. Its author, Malinda Lowery, has an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a graduate degree from Stanford, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She became an associate professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill and head of the Center for the Study of the American South. In 2020, she left UNC to accept the Calhoun Family Chair in American History at Emory University. She happens to be a Lumbee. Professor Lowery's argument is sophisticated, using a postmodern approach fashionable in cultural studies today, that race and ethnicity are social constructs. She challenges the concept of race, nation, and tribe as being European constructs. Quote, Indian identity, indeed all identity, she writes, is a historical process, not a fixed constant from which we can measure change. Identity can include seemingly organic features of an Indian tribe, but those markers change over time, as well as those inside and for those outsiders who interpret Indian identity, unquote. Her book is about how the Lumbees, quote, have crafted an identity as a people, a race, a tribe, and a nation by adopting and adapting racial segregation in order to protect their distinct identity. Professor Lowery notes that between 1885 and 1956, the group has adopted 4 different names, quote, not because they didn't know who they were or what constituted their identity, but because the federal and state officials kept changing their criteria for authenticity, unquote. They have been called Croatans, Tuscarora, Cherokee, and now Cheraw. She argues that according to oral tradition, the ancestors of the Lumbees were from 3 places: Roanoke River in northeastern North Carolina and southern Virginia, the Piedmont and eastern North Carolina, including the Hatteras, the Tuscarora, and the Saponi tribes, and the Piedmont region south and west of present-day Robeson County, including the Cheraw, Waccammaw, and Pedee tribes. Lowery identifies as the forefathers who migrated to Robeson County in the 1700s as Major and John Locklear, Ishmael Chavis, John Brooks, and Charles Oxendine. Quote, the evidence indicates that some of these men were members of the Cheraw and Waccammaw groups who lived in and around Robeson County in the second half of the 17th century, unquote. But, quote, it seems that all of them married Indian women and their children then founded the community that coalesced in Robeson County, unquote. Lowery acknowledged that some genealogists argue that these ancestors of the Lumbees were not Indians but whites and free blacks. But, she writes, they based this view on pre-Civil War records that labeled families with common Lumbee surnames as mulatto, white, mixed, free Negro, and others, or free colored. Historians have long established, however, that these labels require context and they are not by themselves reliable indicators of ancestry, unquote. Lowery argues that the genealogists did not differentiate between these families and the surnames in Robeson County and those with the same surnames elsewhere in the South. She dismisses historical evidence to the contrary found in a published work that she lists in her own bibliography. The book is by genealogist Paul Heinig, is titled Free African Americans in North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, from the colonial period to about 1820. Heinig compiled relatively complete genealogies of African American families, including the Chavis, Locklear, Lowery, and Oxidine families. His conclusion is, quote, most of the Lumbee Indian families listed in the 1790 and 1800 Robeson County census as other free are traced in this history back to persons referred to as Negroes in Virginia, unquote. The earliest member of the Chavis family, according to Heinig, was Bartholomew Chavis, who was living in Henrico County, Virginia in 1708 when he recorded his cattle mark. In March 1719 to 1720, he received a patent for 300 acres on the north side of the Roanoke River in North Carolina, in what was then Chowan County, later Bertie County, and then Northampton County. In 1726, he owned over 1,000 acres of land on the Roanoke and another 630 acres on the south side of the Roanoke River. One of Bartholomew Chavis's sons seems to have been Jacob Chavis, born in circa 1710. In May 1735, Jacob Chavis was granted 100 acres in Bladen County, east of present-day Fayetteville, near Locks Creek and the Cape Fear River. Under the name John Jacob Shives, he received a land grant of 737 or 220 acres near Rockfish Creek. Jacob's son, John Chavis, was listed in 1755 as the head of a household of 6 mulattoes in Cumberland County. In 1776, John was listed with his wife as mulattoes in Bladen County. In 1727, Bartholomew granted his son William Chavis land in Bertie County, which later became Edgecombe County. He was listed in 1742 as owning 15 blacks. It is of note that we have an example of free blacks owning slaves. Edgecombe later became part of Granville County, and Chavis was mentioned in the 1753 court case as the owner of a lodging house at which a lodger had stolen some money. When the lodger asked Chavis to search for the money, Chavis is reported as saying, quote, I am a black man and don't care to undertake such a thing. It is of note that Chavis was referring to himself here as a black man, putting to rest the argument offered by Malinda Lowery that it was a matter of self-identification versus identification by outsiders. The Oxidine family dates back to John Oxidine, also known as Figaro, who successfully sued for his freedom in Northumberland County, Virginia in January of 1723/5. In 1753, he moved to Bladen County, North Carolina, where he was living on the east side of Drowning Creek. Charles Oxidine, probably the son of John Oxidine, obtained a patent for 150 acres northeast of Drowning Creek in 1767. He was listed as a mixed blood taxable in Bladen County from 1766 to 1768, and a mulatto taxable in 1770 and 1771. Charles Oxidine's son, John Oxidine, married Margaret Maynor, who, quote, probably was the daughter of John Maynor, head of a Sampson County household of other free persons in the 1790 census. The earliest record of the Lowery family was in October 1767, when James Lowery was granted a land patent in Bladen County, North Carolina. Between 1770 and 1772, he bought more than 1,000 acres in the county. He was listed with his wife as taxable mulattoes from 1768 to 1774. In 1779, he owned 2 slaves, 400 acres of improved land, and 100 head of cattle. He bought and sold land along Drowning Creek in Robeson County. James Lowery owned about 1,000 acres and 9 slaves when he died in Robeson County in 1810. He was described by older white residents who remembered him as, quote, well-proportioned, fine-looking, respectable mulatto, characterized by elegance and refinement of manners, tall and commanding in personal appearance, urban, courtly, and genteel, unquote. The Locklear family originated in Virginia as well. They were early residents of Lunenburg County, Virginia, and Edgecombe County, North Carolina. They were taxed as mixed race in Bladen and Granville counties in the 1760s. In the 1730s, the Locklear family and the Chavis family lived in Edgecombe County, which later was incorporated into Halifax County, North Carolina. In 1770, William Chavis of Granville County charged Thomas Lowery, quote, free Negro, with trespass. The latter was identified as Thomas Locklear in the 1780 Granville tax list. Robert Locklear purchased a plantation in Edgecombe County, North Carolina, in December 1738. His land adjoined the Roanoke River, the Quantee, Possum, and Chavis branch. His son, John Locklear, bought 100 acres of land on the south side of Gum Swamp and Drowning Creek in 1752. He and his wife were listed as mulattoes in Bladen County in 1768. The above genealogical history is a remarkable story of free African Americans who owned extensive tracts of land and even slaves in colonial North Carolina. However, despite their economic status, whites in the colonies did not approve of them. In a 1715 law, prohibited the Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians from voting for members of the colonial assembly. When this law was revised in 1734 and in 1743, there was no racial restriction, only restrictions on property, residence, and age. However, historian John Hope Franklin notes, quote, there is no evidence, however, that Negroes voted during the colonial period, unquote. After the American Revolution, free African Americans who owned property technically could vote. According to the 1776 Constitution of North Carolina, all freedmen 21 years or old who have been inhabitants of the state for 1 year prior to the election and possessed at least 50 acres of land in at least 6 months, for at least 6 months, were eligible to vote for members of the state Senate and House of Commons. Thus, several of the ancestors of the Lumbees would have qualified to vote under this law. John Hope Franklin argues that the North Carolina laws were less onerous than those in neighboring South Carolina and Virginia. It is small wonder then, wrote John Hope Franklin, that the counties of the densest free Negro population in North Carolina were those adjacent to or near to the Virginia and South Carolina border. In 1835, North Carolina revised its constitution. Under the new constitution, free Negroes, mulattoes, and free persons of mixed blood descended from a Negro ancestor to the 4th generation inclusive, though one ancestor in each generation may have been a white person, could not vote. Despite these discriminatory restrictions, the ancestors of the Lumbees continued to thrive. According to the 1860 census, Robeson County was the second only to New Hanover County, which included valuable town property in Wilmington, in the value of property owned by free Negroes. In the 1860 census, free Negroes in Robeson County owning property valued at more than $2,500 included Wiley Locklear, Nelson Smith, Hardy Bell, George Dial, and James Oxendine. Everyone else was listed as a farmer, except Bell, whose occupation was not listed. In 1857, Henry Chavis emigrated to Liberia, which was founded as a homeland for American free blacks by the African American Colonization Society. During the Civil War, the Lumbees acted and were treated as though they were free blacks. They were assigned to building fortifications at Fort Fisher at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, which the Union forces wanted to secure in order to stop Confederate blockade runners. They were also suspected of aiding Northern prisoners of war and Union troops. In 1864, a wealthy planter named James P. Barnes accused the sons of Allen Lowery of stealing and butchering two of his best hogs, allegedly to feed free escaped Union prisoners. In December 1864, Barnes was shot on his way to the Clay Valley Post Office, where he was postmaster. He lived long enough to accuse William and Henry Lowery of the shooting. There had been a feud between the Lowery family and members of the Home Guard and a member of the Home Guard named James Brantley Harris. Harris and the Home Guard attempted to arrest the two Lowery brothers on charges of desertion, and in the process, Harris killed two Lowerys. On January 15, 1865, Harris was killed allegedly by Henry Berry Lowery and his gang. In March, the Home Guard under Captain Hugh McGregor arrested Allen Lowery, his wife Mary, three of their sons, Calvin, Sinclair, and William, and their neighbor, George Dial. The Lowery women were locked in the smokehouse, and the men kept outside for questioning. The guard accused the Lowerys of highway robbery and aiding escaped Union prisoners and Confederate deserters, and of avoiding service by building fortifications outside of Wilmington. William Lowery tried to escape, but he was shot and returned to the smokehouse. Then the Home Guard picked a jury from among their ranks and tried the captives on the spot. Allen and William were found guilty, and they were taken back to their home place, where they were executed by a firing squad. Henry Berry Lowery, the surviving son, organized a band of outlaws that took revenge on the murderers of his father and brothers. Alfred Townsend, a reporter for the New York Herald, wrote that the Lowerys were industrious carpenters whose handiwork is seen in Lumberton, Shoe Heel, and all around the region. The whites hated the settlement because it was a bad example to the Negroes, unquote. Townsend described the outlaw chief, Henry Berry Lowery, as, quote, a yellow fellow, Indian-looking, of mixed Tuscarora, mulatto, and white blood, who has straight black hair like an Indian. Lowery, according to Townsend, is, quote, one of the handsomest mulattoes you ever saw. He concluded that the Lowerys and their blood relatives showed Indian traces, while Shuffletown at large is mainly plain, unromantic mulatto. Shuffletown was the name used by whites for the area where the most Lumbees lived. Townsend said of Henry Berry Lowery, quote, there is not probably a Negro in Shuffletown who would betray him, and his prowess is a household word for every black family in seaboard Carolina, unquote. Townsend was the creator of the legendary image of Lowery as a type of Robin Hood or Rob Roy. In 1872, he published a book called The Swamp Outlaws, or The Lowery Bandits of North Carolina, being a complete history of the modern Rob Roys or Robin Hoods. The cover contained an idealized illustration of Henry Berry Lowry dressed in buckskin but wearing a jaunty hat with a feathered band. In 1867, William Birney, an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau, investigated these events. Two ministers named Reverend John H. Cobble and Reverend Luther McKinnon defended the actions of Robert Mackenzie and the Home Guard, but said that the Lowrys had always claimed to be Indians and, quote, disdained the idea that they are any way connected with the African race, unquote. However, by aiding Union troops and prisoners of war and fighting against the Home Guard, the Lowrys were acting more as free blacks than as Native Americans. Unlike the Lumbees, the Cherokee were divided over the Civil War. Some Cherokee owned slaves, yet others in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma sided with and fought for the Union. After an initial position of neutrality, the Eastern Cherokee chief John Ross signed a treaty of alliance with the Confederacy. In North Carolina, William Holland Thomas, the so-called white chief, an Indian agent to the Cherokee, who happened to be a cousin of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis, organized the Thomas Legion, which included 400 Cherokee in his Cherokee Battalion. They fought under the Confederate General Jubal Early in his Shenandoah campaign. In 1868, the North Carolina state legislature, under Republican Reconstruction, gave non-whites the right to vote. And in 1875, under the so-called Redeemers, the Democrats who regained control of the state legislature called another constitutional amendment to a constitutional convention to amend the 1868 Constitution. In the same year, North Carolina established its public schools based on a two-race black and white system of segregation. In 1885, a conservative Democrat legislator named Hamilton McMillan, who represented Robeson County, sponsored a bill to recognize the Robeson County Indians as Croatoan Indian tribe. The name was based on a folk legend that the Lumbees were the descendants of the Lost Colony of Roanoke. This legend originated in part in the 1590 journal of John White, the governor of the Lost Colony. When a rescue party led by White himself came to the location of the settlement, they saw the initials CRO carved on a tree. White did not think they had left in the presence of danger because the letters did not have a cross on them. His rescue party continued to the site of the houses but found they had been taken down and the site surrounded by a fortress palisades made of logs, and they noted that on one of the trees or posts at the right side of the entrance had the bark taken off, and 5 feet above the ground in capital letters the word Croatoan, Croatoan, without any sign of any cross or sign of distress. White concluded, quote, I greatly joyed that I had safely found a certain token of their safe being at Croatoan, which is a place where Manitou, their Indian guide, was born, and the savages of the land were our friends. The state recognition of the Croatoan Indians enabled the Robeson County Board of Education to establish Indian-only schools. In 1887, North Carolina passed a law sponsored by Macmillan to fund a normal school to train Indian teachers. The 1888 Croatoan Indians petitioned the federal government for educational aid based on their Indian identity. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, T.J. Morgan, rejected their request on the basis of the lack of funds rather than questioning or not whether they were Indians. By 1914, there were 27 Indian-only schools in Robeson County. In 1932, Angus W. McLean, Then the former governor of North Carolina wrote about the Lumbees, quote, "The overwhelming majority of the Indian race has been very jealous in their efforts to keep their blood pure. When special schools were established for the Indians about 1885, they insisted upon excluding from these schools, as the law requires, persons of Negro blood, however remote the strain," unquote. The Lumbees not only denied blacks admission to their Indian school, they also excluded other racially mixed families not part of their group. In 1913, the Goins family, who came from a racial mixed group in South Carolina known as the Smilings, petitioned to enroll their children in the Indian Normal School, but the school board of trustees denied them admission. The North Carolina Supreme Court overturned the local school board and ordered the Goins children had to be admitted to the school. In response, the Robeson County School Board established a separate school for the family known as the Smiling Independent Indian School. In June 1913, N. McMinnis, the mayor of Pembroke, wrote a letter to A.J. Maxwell, the clerk of the North Carolina Corporation Commission, in regard to the town's council request to have 3 waiting rooms in the ACL Railroad waiting room. The reason, said McMinnis, was because, quote, "We have 3 races in this part of Robeson County to consider in the matter, with the white, the Negro, and the Cherokee Indian, the last name being very much in the majority of the other 2, and they will not go into the Negro waiting room any more than we will, waiting for trains, and they all go in the white waiting room with the whites without being asked there, as they also ride in the white cars with white people without being asked there or without being ejected by the railroad conductors. There is quite a bad feeling existing between them and the whites on this account. There are some of the Indians who are very nice and good people, and there are a large majority of them who are otherwise. The white ladies with little children along have been forced to choose the outside waiting room here on the account of conduct of these Indians having to take cold weather and rain and snow and sleet as a matter of the best choice," unquote. The document indicates that the whites discriminated against both blacks and the Lumbee Indians. The Lumbee Indians themselves discriminated against blacks. For example, the Carolina Theater in Lumberton had 2 separate entrances, one for whites and the others for colored, that is, blacks and Indians, and the balcony was divided by wooden partitions into white, Indian, and black sections. By the 1930s, the movie theaters in Red Spring and Roland and Riverside theaters in Lumberton all had 3 separate entrances. Today, many of the Brooks settlement members claim to be Tuscarora Indians. In 1984, the Robeson County Tuscaroras submitted the application for federal recognition. The BIA rejected their petition based on the argument that the Tuscarora were a group of individuals, not a tribe. In response, in 1989, the Tuscarora created a coalition named the Tuscarora Tribe of North Carolina and again filed for recognition, but the BIA also denied the petition. In 1970, a group of parents in Robeson County, many of whom were related to the Lumbees, formed the Eastern Carolina Tuscarora Indian Indian Organization. The Tuscaroras in Robeson County became politically militant and joined the American Indian movement in its protest on Washington in October 1972, which ended in the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs office and the theft of BIA documents. The Tuscarora claim is also highly unlikely. The Cheraw Indians fought on the side of white North Carolinians in the Tuscarora Indian War between 1711 and 1714. After the war, most of the Tuscarora-speaking Indians migrated north into the province of New York, where they became the sixth nation of the Iroquois Confederacy. A few remained in northeastern North Carolina, but it would have been highly unlikely for them to seek refuge among their enemies, the Cheraw. Heinig notes that according to the colonial records, there were about 300 Tuscarora living in Bertie County in northeast North Carolina between 1752 and 1761. In 1766, when they signed a lease to the land, they were reduced to only 160 people, but after the lease was signed, 155 of them moved to the province of New York. Those left behind joined others in New York in 1802. In January 1958, when a group of 70 Ku Klux Klan members, led by Reverend James Catfish Cole, held a rally outside the town of Maxton in Robeson County to protest a Lumbee woman who was dating a white man, the rally was disrupted by several hundred Lumbees carrying arms. When shots were fired, the Klansmen fled, and the local and state police quickly restored peace. However, the events made national news as, quote, an Indian uprising in Robeson County. Catfish Cole was sentenced to 2 years in prison for inciting a riot. The incident was celebrated by a folk revival song titled The Battle of Maxton Field, written by Malvina Reynolds and recorded by Pete Seeger. The irony is that like the Klan, the Lumbees not only embraced segregation, they also fought efforts by the federal government to integrate their schools. Pembroke State College was open to whites in 1953, and to blacks the following year. In the late 1960s, federal officials tried to integrate the Lumbee schools by threatening to withhold federal funds. And in the fall of 1970, the federal government officially ordered Robeson County to end its segregated school system. A group of Lumbees defied this order by organizing a sit-in in one of their old schools. The Lumbees also filed a lawsuit in the Eastern District Court in Fayetteville, asking that Native Americans be exempted from the pupil reassignment plan. They argued that Brown v. Board of Education decision was designed to help African Americans, but it would hurt Native Americans. However, the suit was unsuccessful. When in the fall of 1971, federal and state officials tried to enforce the plan to enroll African Americans in the Indian-only school and bus Lumbee children to other county schools, a group of Lumbee parents, some of whom held hatchets, blocked the entrance of the African American students to the school. Malinda Lowery maintains that even though the federal government doesn't recognize the Lumbees, this does not prevent them from becoming a nation. Nationhood and its attendant claims of sovereignty, she writes, do not depend solely on outsiders' recognition of identity. Insiders' perpetual maintenance of an identity is also a critical component. She says that ethnic and racial identities are situational, and the issue is one of self-determination. While it's true that ethnicity and race are social constructs, this does not mean that they are social fictions. If anything is proven by the history of the Lumbees, it is that race and racism have important factors in explaining why they felt it necessary to become an Indian tribe and why they resisted efforts to desegregate their schools. Since race has become such a flashpoint in these discussions, it might be more useful to think of descent in terms of ethnicity rather than race. Malinda Lowery begins her latest book, Lumbee Indians, An American Struggle, 2018, also published by University of North Carolina Press, with what she calls a genealogy, presented in the form of an epic poem spoken by an African Cheraw. The genealogy lists the name and Greek epithets like the epithets of the forefathers down to the present day and herself. In her dissertation, Lowery writes that evidence indicates that some of these men were members of the Cherokee and Waccammaw groups who lived in and around Robeson County in the century, second half of the 17th century. But it seemed all of them married Indian women, and their children founded the community coalescence in Robeson County. But her so-called evidence are not primary sources, but rather a report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in March 1912, and two reports commissioned by the Lumbee Regional Development Authority in 1976 and 1987. In April 2021, the Lumbees again tried to obtain federal recognition by a means of an act of Congress. This time it made it through the House of Representatives, Committee on Indian Affairs, the full House of Representatives, and were referred to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. President Joe Biden had made a campaign promise to sign into law if it passed the Senate. Again, the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians opposed the bill. I had a telephone call with Deborah Dodson, the president of the Delaware Nation in Anadarko, Oklahoma, to whom I was introduced by Teresa Johnson, a Delaware woman from Moraviantown, Canada. As a result, 144 tribal leaders in Oklahoma came out against the so-called Lumbee Fairness Act and asked Congress to refer the matter to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to investigate whether the Lumbee claim to descent to a historic American Indian tribe. See the YouTube titled Defending Tribal Sovereignty. Again, the bill died in committee. In the final analysis, it comes down to a question of who has the right to define which groups are recognized Indian tribes. Advocates for the Lumbees say that the Lumbees alone have that right. Others argue that Congress can and should decide these matters through the political process. Still others, myself included, and now increasing numbers of Native American tribes, argue that these cases should be vetted by experts at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, not by politicians or advocate scholars. It is true that individuals and groups have been known to change their ethnic identities. Indeed, the Lumbees already have succeeded in reinventing themselves as an Indian tribe. However, if a group of people wishes to qualify for the benefits that accrue from the semi-sovereign nation of being a recognized American Indian tribe, descent not only matters, it must be established by documented historical evidence, not just by oral tradition. The issue of the Lumbee Indians is larger than whether a group that adopts an American Indian should be guaranteed the semi-sovereign sovereignty afforded to Native American groups who can trace their ancestries to a known historical tribe. It is a matter of how to assess historical evidence. As John Adams once said, facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passion, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence.